To another episode of Becoming a Techno Wizard, and today we're continuing our series on Hegel, of course. Section or part 47 today. We're going to be going through sections 117 and 118. Without further ado, let's just jump into it, y'all. You know what's up. So, in the last section, here is my summary, and of course, I go on to Dr. Sadler's. So, my summary of the last section, I say, continuing chapter 2, Hegel shows how properties are consistent with themselves, but also come together as I don't know why I put that there, as as the one that is exclusionary to any other. Yet the other also can be identified by their own properties that can be similar yet different to any other object. He then goes on to set up the idea that the object may be self-identifiable or self-identical. Really, that's probably it, actually. Meaning it holds its own truth. In this case, the subject, that is the perceiver, opens themselves up to perception by trying to add or subtract from the object with their perception. I also go on some tangents, mentioning how this seems to relate to animism, where objects have life in and of themselves, separate or regardless of human perception. It's a fun episode. So that was my kind of summary of the last section. Let's see what Dr. Sadler says here. He says, in these sections, Hegel turns the focus on the properties of the thing, i.e., the object of perception, unfolding the implications of their determinacy. These properties are determinate not only as sensuous universals, but also by opposing themselves to the other properties, but within the thing and in other things. Oh goodness, both within the thing and the other thing. I was like, but I say two butts. All right. So let me say that again. These properties are determinate not only as sensuous universals, but also by opposing themselves to the other properties, both within the thing and in other things. This leads to more fully understanding what it is to be a thing perceived. It is not simply a medium in which the properties can coexist together, and also, but rather a one, a unity that excludes its other. After having set out these developments, Hegel then turns to the relation between the perceiving subject and the object of perception. Truth here lies on the side of the object and is conceived of as self sameness or self identity, and any difference from this on the side of the subject can become untruth or deception. So yeah, he was a lot more detailed in that one. I ain't gonna lie. Got that one also. So let's jump into the next one.
Let us see now what consciousness experiences in its actual perceiving. For us, this experience is already contained in the development of the object and of the attitude of consciousness towards it given just now. It is only a matter of developing the contradictions that are present therein. The object which I apprehend presents itself purely as a one, but I also perceive in it a property which is universal and which thereby transcends the singularity of the object. The first being of the objective essence as a one was therefore not its true being. But since the object is what is true, the untruth falls in me. My apprehension was not correct. On account of the universality of the property, I must rather take the objective essence to be, on the whole, a community. I now further perceive the property to be determinate, opposed to another and excluding it. Thus, I did not, in fact, apprehend the objective essence correctly when I defined it as a community with others, or as a continuity. On account of the determinateness of the property, I must break up the continuity and posit the objective essence as a one that excludes. In the broken up one, I find many such properties which do not affect one another, but are mutually indifferent. Therefore, I did not perceive the object correctly when I apprehended it as exclusive. On the contrary, just as previously it was only continuity in general, so now it is a universal common medium in which many properties are present as sensuous universalities, each existing on its own account and as determinate excluding the others. But this being so, what I perceive as the simple and the true is also not a universal medium, but the single property by itself, which, however, is such, is neither a property nor a determinate being. For now it is neither in a one nor connected with others. Only when it belongs to a one is it a property, and only in relation to others is it determinate. As is pure relating of itself to itself, it remains merely sensuous being in general, since it no longer possesses the character of negativity. And the consciousness which takes its object to be a sensuous being is only my meaning. It has ceased altogether to perceive and has withdrawn into itself. But sensuous being and mind meaning themselves pass over into perception. I am thrown back to the beginning and drawn once again into the same cycle, which supersedes itself in each moment and as a whole.
Ooh, that's a long section. So I'll try not to talk as much because I have a call at noon. But I did want to get into this a little bit. This does seem to be, like I said, because in the last segment, right, he's like building up this argument, right, and then this one he's kind of like taking it apart again, which is interesting. So, object which I apprehend presents itself purely as a one, but I also perceive it in a property which is universal and which thereby transcends the singularity of the object. The first being of the objective essence as a one was therefore not its true being. So if we see these objects as like, oh, in and of themselves per se, maybe is he saying that's not the truth of the situation? um I don't know. Sorry, I got messages coming. Okay, it's nothing. All right.
A property which is
Let's just
contained in the
see.
belongs to itself, it
sorry.
remains merely sensuous being in general, since it no longer possesses the character of negativity, each moment and as a whole. What we see Hegel doing in section 117, this very long section, is actually a sort of summary and recap of what has been happening in the sections just preceding it in perception. So he's going to start out saying, let's see now what consciousness experiences in its actual perceiving. For us, this experience is already contained in the development of the object and the attitude of consciousness given just now, what we've run through up till this point. So then he goes on and he's giving us an idea of where this is supposed to go. Remember that we always have dialectical development taking place, which is we have a process that we run through, and then we see that something else must be going on, and we want to try to make that explicit. We want to try to bring that to light so that we can make some progress from that point. Progress that's going to retain what we've got to developed up until this point, so that we're not just throwing everything away, but rather incorporating it, what Hegel calls sublation, or in German Aufhebung. So he says it's a matter of developing the contradictions that are present therein. And we've seen him doing that, but now we're going to run through these contradictions one more time. He says the object which I apprehend presents itself purely as a one, as some sort of unity. So for example, this book is an object, it is a one. The ubiquitous piece of chalk that I've been using as an example over and over again is a unity, a one. So we have consciousness, and consciousness is looking at or perceiving in some way, experiencing an object, and the object is experienced as a one. So far, so good. He says, I also perceive in it a property which is universal, which thereby transcends the singularity of the object. And this can take place in multiple ways, right? We can think about the one itself and how we're framing that in terms of multiple properties. We can also think of that property, that universal. It's a universal because it can apply to more than one thing, and it's the same property more or less, in the two pieces of white chalk, right? It's the same whiteness, it's the same hardness. There's a sensuous universality that we find transcending the object, the one, and aligned with other objects. So we can think of the universal as also what is connecting the two ones or multiple ones together. So he goes on, he says, the first being of the objective essence is one was therefore not its true being. We've had some sort of realization. We've recognized that truth was not where we thought it was. But since the object is what is true, up until this point, the untruth falls in me. Like I put over here, consciousness in this part of perception is saying, well, if anything got wrong, if there was any untruth that comes to light, anything that doesn't actually match or follow through or is inadequate, it's on the side of consciousness. It's on the side of the perceiver. This is what we just finished with in the end of section 116, talking about the possibility of deception, of illusion, Wahnsinn, right? So he goes on and he says, on account of the universality of the property, I have to take the objective essence to be on the whole a community. Now, what does he mean by that? He means that now we're distributing truth or essence or what is the case, what is real. We're distributing it not in just one thing, in one, but rather into a community. And we're doing this in multiple ways that he's not making totally explicit here. The one itself is already a community, that's where we're going to be going with this, but the one is also in a community in the way that we perceive the world with other ones. I can perceive this as a piece of chalk because it's not the only piece of chalk in the world. It's not what we call in classical studies a hapax legomenon. That means a Greek word that shows up only once, it's said only once, a single time. A hapax legomenon, when it shows up in a Greek text, we don't actually know what it means because unless somebody's actually defined it, we can't figure out, through its relations to other things, how to pin down that meaning. And why can't we pin down that meaning? Very simply because it's not available in multiple things where we can look at it and do some comparison. When it comes to universalities, it's the fact that they're present in more than one thing in a community that allows us to perceive them as universals. So he says, did not apprehend the objective essence correctly when I defined it as a community with others or as a continuity. On account of the determinateness of the property, I must break up the continuity and posit the objective essence as a one that excludes. And we've seen this too, right? The one is the one by not being the other one. The property is the property by not being the other property. I've got that sort of depicted here as we move to the more sophisticated view that he's put out in the last several paragraphs. Each property is itself a universality. Each involves a negation of the other properties by way of being what it is. That's what allows it to have determinacy. So, in the salt, the saltiness is not the same thing as the whiteness, is not the same thing as the cubical nature, is not the same thing as the sharpness, or however we want to define it. So he says, I must break up the continuity, posit the objective essence as a one that excludes. In the broken up one, so in this one over here, I find many such properties which do not affect one another, but which are mutually indifferent. So we've taken away negation at that point. We have just properties. We're talking about it as we had earlier, where it's a indifferent medium. You remember instead of the one, the also. So the also allows these properties to be in relation to each other, but not to really matter to each other, not to connect with each other, not to push off. That's another way you might think of Hegelian negation, pushing off of each other. Instead, they're connected with each other just by being in the same thing. As soon as we try to make that determinate, as soon as we want to go further with this, we end up starting to introduce some reliefs, some contrast into this, where something is not another thing. There's opposition, there's negation. So he says, I didn't perceive the object correctly when I apprehended it as an exclusive. On the contrary, it was previously just continuity in general. It's a common medium, and that's not going to work, though, right? Many properties are present as sensuous universalities, each existing on its own account. How can they exist on their own account? Well, only by being in relation to each other in a way that's more than just also, more than just the medium here. So he goes on and he says, as determinate, they exclude the others. So if this is so, what I perceive as the simple and the true, for example, this property here, this is where the true is. It's not a universal medium. It's not the one itself. It's rather the single property by itself. Now notice what he's going to do here. He's going to introduce a number of interesting, you might say almost even paradoxical considerations. If we're thinking about a single property by itself, in abstraction, from everything else, we're not really thinking the single property as a property. Why not? Because what it means to be a property is two things. It has to be a property of something. So it's a property of the one, not just a property existing in a valueless, doesn't affect it at all sort of medium, like something floating in a petri dish. That's not the way properties of things ontologically work. So it can't be a property unless it's part of something, unless it's a property that exists in community. But then what does it exist in community with? This is the second thing. In relation to other properties. And of each of these, we can say these are true too, can't we? But then we have truth in...
Hey, welcome. Is it Yili? Y-L-I. Says this chapter is really hard for me to understand. Yeah, it seems to be breaking it down, like what they've been discussing over the last couple sections. And sorry, I haven't been talking. It's like dogs barking, people coming in. It's just I picked the wrong time to do this, but I'll go ahead and finish it. But yeah, it seems like he's just breaking it down, kind of summarizing what they were saying before, which I find pretty interesting. I understand this part where he's talking about with property being in community, because you can't see each property as its own thing, right? Because like you said, it's a part of the larger object, the larger thing that you're trying to understand. But yeah, I'm curious to see like what he's getting to with this, because it seems like Hegel has a big thing of like re-explaining what he said in a different way, but with bigger words. So it can be confusing at times. It feels like a kind of rehash, but more complicated. But at the same time, I understand that's kind of how people wrote back in the day as well. Not people meaning like academics, right? Because the only people who could write back then were like these academic folks. So it kind of comes with the territory. That's why I really appreciate Dr. Sattler's charts here. It makes it much easier to understand. But yes, hello, and welcome. Let's continue.
You might say, oppositional or negational relationship with something else.
Yeah,
that's true.
same thing.
It's a matter of our shifting our perspective. So when we're attending to the whiteness of the chalk, we are, pushing off or not attending to or setting aside the other qualities of the chalk. The more focusing on the whiteness, the less we're focusing on the dryness or the hardness of it. So he goes on and he says, the true is a single property by itself, which as such is neither a property nor a determinate being. Why? Because it's neither in a one nor connected with others. Only when it belongs to a one is it a property. Only in relation to others is it determinate. And unless you want it to be an indeterminate property, you got to have both of these together. There really isn't an indeterminate property anyway. He's saying these are two conditions that have to be met. It has to be part of a one. It has to exist in relation to other properties. So notice what this would also exclude. He doesn't go over this here, but that would exclude anything where you had a one, a unity, a thing that only had one property. For a thing to be a thing means that it has multiple properties. There are multiple points of view by which you can look at it, multiple ways in which you can grasp its truth. So he goes on and he says, as its pure relating of its...
I'm gonna make a little guess here. I think that's gonna be a hint, right? I think that's like a hint what he said here.
means that it has multiple properties. There are multiple points of view by which you can look at it, multiple ways in which you can grasp its truth.
Yeah, I feel like Dr. Sadler's trying to hint us to what he's building up to. That because that seems like a big, you know, idea. Like just blow that up to like the concept of what we're talking about, consciousness, or the absolute or whatever. You begin to see that, oh, it has to be something which is true from multiple perspectives, but at the same time, the truth encompasses all those different perspectives. So you can say that if you only see one side of the thing, then you don't really have the truth. But at the same time, it's not like you're completely untrue, but you only have a piece of it, right? Does that mean that you have the truth at all if you only have a piece? That could be interesting, perspective there to explore. So I'm curious to see, how he's gonna loop that back in.
So he goes on and he says, as its pure relating of itself to itself, it remains merely sensuous being in general, since it no longer possesses the character of negativity. That's what we're trying to get away from, right? And the consciousness which takes its object to be a sensuous being is only my meaning, my intending. What's taking place through perception. When I'm just focusing on one property in isolation from everything else, there's a kind of idiocy, a kind of idiosyncrasy involved there, a kind of abstractness that doesn't even realize that it's lost hold of the truth. And where consciousness goes wrong is the untruth is just on my side. It's not actually on the side of the object. Nothing's going on there. That's untrue. So he says, sensuous being and my meaning themselves pass over into perception. I'm thrown back to the beginning and drawn once again into the same cycle, which supersedes itself in each moment and as a whole. So what is he concluding with there? Each time that we follow through this, each time that we go through this sequence, what we're running into is the same dynamic playing itself out. And now we've been able to see how the contradictions emerge from this act of perception. The question is, where are we going to go from here?
Mm-hmm. Let's see. I made my
consciousness, therefore, necessarily runs through this cycle again, but this time not in the same way as it did the first time. For it has experienced in perception that the outcome and the truth of perception is its dissolution, or is reflection out of the true and into itself. Thus, it becomes quite definite for consciousness how its perceiving is essentially constituted. That is, that it is not a simple pure apprehension, but in its apprehension is at the same time reflected out of the true and into itself. This return of consciousness into itself, which is at the same time reflected out of the true and into itself.
I like this. Thus becomes definite for consciousness how its perceiving is essentially constituted, as not a simple pure apprehension, but in its apprehension is at the same time reflected out of the true into itself. So I think that's saying, like, again, kind of like what was mentioned before, right? Like we see a certain perspective of the truth or whatever we see, and that tells us more about, ourselves, in addition to what we're looking at. Or I don't know, maybe I said that wrong.
itself. This return of consciousness into itself, which is directly mingled with the pure apprehension of the object. For this return into itself, shown itself to be essential to perception, is the truth. Consciousness once recognizes this aspect as its own and takes responsibility for it. For by doing so, it will obtain the true object in its purity. This being so, we have now in the case of perception the same as happened in the case of sense certainty, the aspect of consciousness being driven back into itself, but not in the first instance in the sense in which this happened in sense certainty, that is, not as if the truth of perception fell in consciousness. On the contrary, consciousness recognizes that it is the untruth occurring in perception that falls within it. But by this very recognition, it is able at once to supersede this untruth. It distinguishes its apprehension of the truth from the untruth of its perception, corrects this untruth, and since it undertakes to make this correction itself, the truth, qua truth of perception, falls, of course, within consciousness. The behavior of consciousness, which we have now to consider, is thus so constituted that consciousness no longer merely perceives, but is also conscious of its reflection into itself, and separates this from simple apprehension proper.
Yeah, I think this goes into like the idea of consciousness being like an awareness thing. Of I like to call it like almost like infinite recursion, right? It's constantly like looking back on itself to say, what am I aware of? What am I aware I'm aware of? Stuff like that. And how can I, you have this self-referential system that allows it to self-correct. And that means that you have to, constantly reflect and constantly, think about what you're thinking about what you're looking at and all this other stuff. But it allows you to kind of, maneuver through the world. And I find that pretty interesting. But there's something he said here. People, I wonder what he means by this. The truth, qua truth of perception. I know people use that term, the qua. It's such a weird word. I don't know if it means qualia or something like that. Let me look it up. I'm in another tab. Can I share that tab? No, it won't let me share this tab. Okay. For some reason, it wants me to share the one I'm streaming. Weird. All right. But yeah, I looked up qua. It says in the capacity or character of, in the capacity of, as being. What does that mean? in the capacity of as being means in the capacity of character or character of something. A user suggests that this Latin entry. I might have to click into one of these. I don't know. I might have to look into this later. It's like a lot of these definitions. Let me get back. Where is my tab? Okay.
Of perception falls, of course, within consciousness.
But overall, I think it's saying, once we realize something is untrue or might be untrue or something like that, we reflect on ourselves to try and self-correct it, to try and say, okay, what can we do to know better, to improve what we're looking at, to improve our certainty or something like that.
Correction itself, the truth, qua truth of perception, falls, of course, within consciousness. The behavior of consciousness, which we have now to consider, is thus so constituted that consciousness no longer merely perceives, but is also conscious of its reflection into itself, and separates this from simple apprehension proper.
I really like this too, right? Basically saying like that metacognition, right? Consciousness is not just perceiving things, and if anything, being conscious in and of itself is something more than perception, right? It's the awareness of perception. And this is one of the things that I find super interesting about consciousness, especially again nowadays. They come bringing in to this 200-year-old text our modern day, 21st century, I almost said 22nd century, 21st century ideas and knowledge. We think so far, 200 years later, that consciousness is awareness, right? That consciousness is being aware of your perception or of your actions, of your things that's going on. But that also means, right? That also means like things like free will doesn't really make sense in terms of how we typically define it, right? Maybe you can redefine it to mean something else, but the idea that we choose to do everything we think about or that we're doing doesn't really seem to pan out in terms of neurology. What we actually see is that a huge amount of our behaviors, our actions, and things and so on run on habits, run on things that we aren't actually actively thinking about, right? That's unconscious or subconscious, and our actual consciousness is like the thing on top saying, okay, that I like that, I don't like that, let me try to go towards more that way, stuff like that. It's trying to steer us in the direction that we want to go, but it's not actually doing the things, right? And that's really important to recognize, because that shows us that the value, if I could use that word, of consciousness, the magic of consciousness is in its ability to be more aware of itself and the situation that we're in, as opposed to just making decisions. So yeah, this is pretty cool to see this here. But yeah, let's go ahead and get to that breakdown.
Simply restating and retracing what had gone on so far in the previous sections. If section 117 was simply restating and retracing what had gone on so far in the previous sections of perception, what we're going to see happen now in section 118 is an important transition point, a realization on the part of consciousness. And remember, what's going on with the phenomenology is we're tracing out the development of consciousness by observing it as it actually works, and we ourselves are that consciousness at the same time as we're observing it, or we're attempting to at least pretend that's what's going on.
Right.
It's a sort of fiction that we're using in order to try to get a sense of how we actually do in fact perceive things. What is the truth of perception? Now you remember that so far any untruth in perception has been located on the side of consciousness, and the truth of perception was located in the object. The object was sort of given a pass. There couldn't be any untruth on its side because that's what we're attempting to make sense of. And consciousness was, in a certain sense, very, very generous to the object by saying, well, if I've got anything wrong, it must be because I got it wrong. It took responsibility, the term that Hegel's going to use here. It took responsibility for the falsity, the mistake, for the illusion, for the self-deception that's occurring. Is that really the whole story, though? This is where we're going to see an important transition take place. So we've got consciousness, we've got the act of perception, we have the object, and we've seen all these transitions that we don't need to rehearse anymore, the transition from the universal medium in which things are in juxtaposition with each other, through the also to the one, which is a unity, which excludes others. We've seen the property involves negation, which then allows it to have universality, which is its precondition for being a property in the first place. There's multiple properties. All that we don't need to actually go back over again. But what we do want to point out is that's the truth of perception. So if somebody were to ask at this point, wait a second, Hegel, I don't understand. What is the truth of perception? Hegel would say, well, it's this dynamic system that I've charted out for you. It's not just one thing like A equals B. It's rather that here's what A is, and here's what A shows itself as it unfolds, that it involves B, C, D, and each one of them also involves that. The truth here is something complex. So the truth of perception has now been grasped by consciousness, because consciousness has been paying attention to its own processes. And it sees that when it first thought it was perceiving something, what we might call the raw, the crude, the naive act of perception, things didn't actually turn out to be quite the way they were depicted. And so now, as Hegel's going to put it, it's experienced in perception that the outcome and the truth of perception is its disillusion or its reflection out of the truth of perception and into itself. What's he talking about there? What Hegel is saying is that consciousness has not just learned something about the object in all of this, it's learned something about itself. It has confronted itself with the truth of perception and looked at how it got it wrong in the first place. So he calls this, dissolution, breaking down a failure, right? But that's taking place through this reflection into itself. And now that's always going to be an important thing. Whenever some sort of reflection into itself is taking place, that's the side where progress is going to be made. And then Hegel will talk about a mingling, a bringing together of these two things, the reflection into itself and the original perception. What does that do? That calls into question the truth of perception. He says it becomes quite definite for consciousness how its perceiving is essentially constituted. It's not a simple pure apprehension, but it is an apprehension at the same time reflected out of the true and into itself. This return of consciousness into itself, which mingles the pure apprehension of the object, the initial perception, and the return to itself, alters the truth. So what we took to be a fixed point, at least we said, well, at least this part we've got down. We know that there's a truth over here. Turns out it's been altered. So he says, consciousness recognizes this aspect as its own. And again, shows this incredible ontological generosity. It takes responsibility. What does responsibility mean in this case? Who screwed up? Did the object screw up when I was perceiving the piece of chalk? Did the piece of chalk, trick me into thinking that things were not as it were? No. My own processes of thinking about it, of making sense of it, those were what led me astray. So I have to take responsibility for that as the perceiver, as the one who is actually conscious. But that's going to have some very important implications for spirit. He says, consciousness recognizes this aspect as its own, takes responsibility for it. By doing so, it will obtain the true object in its purity. Now, what's the true object? We think that's what is over here, don't we? The true object of perception. So if consciousness can just pay attention to how it screws things up, to where its filters are, where its biases are, where it is over hasty. Maybe if consciousness reads some Descartes and realizes that we shouldn't allow our understanding to outstrip our desire or our will or something along those lines, then consciousness, by taking responsibility, can get a more accurate, a more true, a more genuine perception of the object. That's one way to interpret it. But is that the only way? He says, we have now in the case of perception the same thing that happened in the case of sense certainty. So we want to remember, well, what did happen in the case of sense certainty? And it turned out the truth of sense certainty that we thought was on the side of the object really wasn't on the side of the object. That's why we're in this section, perception, in the first place. If you remember at the end of sense certainty, what we realized was that there was more than just sense certainty going on. There was perception going on. Wahrnehmen, taking the truth of something, something active. The truth that's on the side of the object has to be taken by consciousness. So what else can we say about this? He goes on, and he adds that the aspect of consciousness being driven back into itself is what happened in the case of sense certainty. There's an important difference here, though. Not as if the truth of perception fell in consciousness. That's what didn't happen in sense certainty and is happening here. On the contrary, consciousness recognizes that it is the untruth occurring in perception that falls within it. So what am I taking responsibility for? Untruth, the untruth within consciousness. What does it mean to take responsibility for untruth? It means to introduce a certain sort of truthfulness, though, doesn't it? To cop to having screwed up is to admit something. To say, I was telling you something false is to say something true, unless you were actually making up the fact that you're saying something false in the first place. Then we get into all sorts of liars' paradoxes.
This statement is a lie.
But notice that by taking responsibility, by taking cognizance of itself as having introduced the untruth, untruth should be untruth there, into the act of perception, consciousness is thereby reintroduced truthfulness into perception. He says, by this very recognition, it's able at once to supersede, to overcome, to take into account, to incorporate this untruth. That doesn't mean that the untruth totally goes away, but we're able to in some way redeem it. We're able in some way to make it part of the whole process. Becoming aware of your biases does not automatically remove your biases, but it certainly equips you for being able to deal with your biases when they're likely to occur, when they're likely to be engaged, doesn't it? That's exactly.
And what's so crazy, what's so fascinating about this too, and this is going a little bit of a tangent, but it's related, right? It's like there was a great study that Vsauce shared showing that the attempt to be unbiased is actually far more harmful, right? It actually creates more bias. Trying to be unbiased or say that you're unbiased is actually far more effective to be aware of your bias and build up an argument in the way in your bias, right? But at the same time, find somebody else or find, another, group or whatever that can champion the other side, right? Of that bias. So they have the other bias and then they, fight it out basically to figure out, the better compromise or the more truth or whatever. So it's not to be unbiased, right? Because what happens there, especially with our mind, like our brain just has like hundreds, if not thousands, of cognitive biases of different ways in which we simply cannot see or understand the full truth, right? The very act, like he's showing here, the very, perception of life, the very way we perceive reality means that we are incapable of truly understanding the truth. Like we have no way of actually knowing what is the truth, but we can always get closer, right? And by we can do so by, like we said, doing here, taking responsible for the fact that we see untruth, that we have this bias and everything like that, and having them combat each other, these bias against another bias. So yeah, it's very fascinating that that's all coming together. Is always like these I don't know, interrelations and things like that.
Exactly what he's talking about here, except he's not talking here about biases in a sort of moral fashion or anything like that. He's talking about perceptual biases. So he goes on and he says, it distinguishes its apprehension of the truth from the untruth of its perception, corrects this untruth, and since it undertakes to make this correction itself, since it's active, since there is an agency here, the truth, qua truth of perception, falls, of course, within consciousness. So now, the truth of perception is no longer here. The truth of perception
Is in consciousness.
has now been sucked into the realm of consciousness.
Just isn't that what he showed with sensitivity too, right? It's like everything is just being shown to come back to consciousness, which seems like a cop out, but really is not, right? It's true. It's just that the fact that like the way we perceive the world is through our conscious. Like the whole reason we can communicate is because we're conscious. If it weren't for consciousness, then we'd be like every other animal. We're just running on instinct, or just or have like a. I mean, it's there are predictions or whatever. There are theories that some other animals have some level of consciousness, and that's why they behave in certain ways, right? So either way you go about it, it seems like whenever you have some level of understanding of the world, some awareness of the world, you can have some amount of consciousness there, right? Consciousness as we deem it, right? And which in and of itself might be better worded as awareness or self-awareness or whatever. So I don't know. Very fascinating stuff.
We have realized that the object no longer possesses the primacy that it was being originally granted. Consciousness is what makes the object this. Consciousness is what decides, am I getting the object right in perceiving it, or am I introducing untruth? Consciousness is what can adjust for that untruth and can remedy that untruth, thereby reintroducing truth, and that becomes the greater truth of perception. You remember that earlier I was saying, look, this truth of perception over here, it's not something single, it's all these things together. Another way of saying it is now the truth of perception encompasses all of this together, and it falls within consciousness. So that means that consciousness now has it's not a passive in relation to it. It's active, it's responsible. So he says this, the behavior of consciousness, which we now have to consider, is thus so constituted that consciousness no longer merely perceives. Perception is no longer something passive, but it is also conscious of its reflection into itself. It takes account of what's going on in its own processes and separates this from simple apprehension proper. What might be some examples of this, so we can latch this on to something a bit more concrete? Think about the way camouflage works. Camouflage is supposed to affect perception. And in many cases, it works quite well. As a matter of fact, if camouflage works perfectly, you don't know that camouflage has taken place. And there's a lot of different ways of doing it. There are natural camouflages that animals have, the white bellies that a lot of animals, that are land-dwelling have, combined with a dark, back and sides, flanks, that sort of thing. That helps to break up the profile of the creature, so you can't identify the outlines. You can't identify it in Hegelian terms as an object, as a one, as a unity. Instead, what you see is just the blank and multifarious background that the animal is within. We can say the same thing with ships, and the dazzle effect. We can say the same thing with hiding things in plain sight, with objects. We can say the same thing with body paint as a form of camouflage. And, if we think about the kind of camouflage that we have today with, hunting gear or military gear, all of those are supposed to have roughly the same effect. Now, if you know that that's going on, if you have some experience with that, you can start to adjust in your perception so that you're not going to be as affected by it.
Because you're aware of
that may be a matter of experience, right? So, but part of it can also be a matter of training, or a matter of knowing how to change your own conditions of perception so that you have a better chance at perceiving what's really there. In doing so, you're no longer a passive agent of reception. I know that's a little paradoxical to say passive agent, but follow them through. You're a reflective agent of perception, one that takes account of its own perception and works to improve it, to make it better, to make it more true, to grasp the truth of perception, or better yet said, to enact the truth of perception, to make truth exist.
Well done. That was beautiful. I like this chapter. Or this section. I mean, I like really all of this, but it's just it was great. I like that one as well. But yeah, great stuff. Yeah. Hello. This was great. Another great section. Probably most likely going to do another one tomorrow. I'll try to do it earlier because I have another call at 12. I have a non-work related. I'm on PTO. But yeah, it's cool stuff, man. And consciousness is so fascinating. So it's cool to be able to see how these philosophical ideas of consciousness 200 years ago kind of still stand up today, still very much stand up today. So that's beautiful. But yeah, thank you for listening, thank you for watching. Let me know your thoughts, what you learned, what you have problems with or anything like that. We can try to discuss it together. But yeah, without further ado, that's it. See ya. Bye bye.